It's a pleasure to be here once again. I am going to try to restrain myself to just a few topics here on how view interacts with human beings because we have limited time. And I will, next, here we go. Start with what is the magic of view? And this is a topic that is fairly new to our industry. For most of my career, we only went around measuring illuminance. And did we have sufficient horizontal illuminance? And the windows and what you could see out the windows were simply left out of the conversation. They weren't part of the lighting environment. They weren't part of the architectural environment. They were just holes in a wall. One of the key things that they do is they really anchor us both in place and in time. And this was first put together by two researchers, J. Appleton in 1975, putting together the prospect and refuge theory of the idea that humans like to feel protected and yet have an overview of what is in front of them, sort of like lions lying on the savannah, watching the zebras down below. Or alternatively, the attention restoration theory, which is similar but focused mostly on how nature affects our cognition. These two theories have been there for quite a while, but really have not had an evolution in terms of greater grounding in neuroscience, in human physiology. So I'm going to take this a little off into a metaphor and think about how view interacts with our nutrition in the same way that food might interact with us, to the point where there's both the delight of a wonderful meal that is full of wonderful aromas and colors and gives you a social occasion to enjoy with your family, but also hopefully is nutritious and gives you the basics that you need for health and well-being. So let's see how that might play out a bit with views. My own personal journey started with this building, I think, really. I was doing an assessment of the energy efficiency of a daylit building. It has skylights. It was put up in 1995. And the building owner was very proud of participating in a utility program to save lots of energy. So my job was to go and evaluate how much energy they were really saving and if it was acceptable to the occupants and the building owner. So as I was interviewing young people working in this factory, asking them how they felt about the electric lighting, all they wanted to do was talk about the view. This building owner had built this factory after the earthquake of 1994 in Los Angeles and had such a trauma himself being inside the building in the darkness as the building was falling around him that he vowed he would never work in a building without access to daylight and view, put up these very large windows that are about 15 feet by 30 feet high, if you can translate that into meters, and looking out over the valley. And the young Latina workers in this factory just wanted to tell me about how respected they felt that they had a view in their workplace, how motivated they wanted to come to work. And the building owner was also proud of how happy his workers were. So this was the first experience that really got me thinking about what is the difference between the daylight that we've been providing and this view out the window. Then a few years later, I had this opportunity to study how human performance and relative to daylight illumination in space. And we decided to add view as a control variable because we knew, well, so daylight is sort of confounded with view. Let's try to separate them out. And every possible way that we would define a better view came out as statistically significant in terms of predicting better performance. So bigger view, more human activity, more sky, more vegetation, all these components predicted higher performance, both in office workers and in students. So this was sort of the second hit. What's the magic? How is this coming to be? So really in the last 10 to 15 years, as I've been retiring from my previous profession, I've really tried to consolidate these perspectives on what may be going on cognitively and physiologically in relationship to view and how that relates. So I've put together this little mandala to try to capture the sense that all of these effects are interactive and they're reinforcing each other in some different ways. We can think about them separately, but ultimately they need to come together in a holistic fashion. So first we're going to start with mind wandering. And back in about 25 years ago, in 2001, people started playing with fMRI machines to understand what the brain was doing. And the general task was, can we locate in the brain where mathematical function is, or where musical function is, or where poetry exists? And so people would get slotted into these big fMRI machines and asked to do a mathematical problem or asked to recite a piece of poetry, and the doctors were watching where this activity was in the brain, and then once the task was completed, the brain would shift to another pattern that was recurrent, regardless of whether it was math or poetry or music, that they started to call the default mode network, because it seemed to be where the brain defaulted to. And the thought was originally that this was a resting pattern, except then they realized that no, the brain was actually perhaps even more energetic during this default mode network. So what was going on? After more research, they began to realize that there was an overlap between this default mode network, the recurring pattern in between outward tasks, that was very similar to what is also called mind wandering or daydreaming. And as they studied it more closely, they began to realize that this recurrent pattern was happening every few minutes. It might happen every 1 or 2 minutes, it might be 5 or 6 minutes, but it was sort of a flipping back between an outward view, an outward task, and an inward task. As this has evolved, the default mode network is now considered to be central to what's called the autobiographical self. It's when people are thinking about how comfortable they are. Am I comfortable sitting in this chair? Am I a little cold? Is there a smell that I don't like? Am I hungry? What am I going to do when I get up from this meeting? What am I going to do this evening? And also going backwards. How did I sleep last night? What about that phone call with my mother? It was very upsetting. And so it's also been called time traveling, being able to think backwards in time for your own bodily experience, or think forwards in time. And so this evolution of this concept of the default mode network has continued to a point where there was a very groundbreaking study done at Harvard where they used the new Apple phones at the time and pinged people randomly throughout the day, about 2,000 subjects, saying, what are you doing? What are you thinking about right now? What should you be doing right now? And putting those two things together, they realized that regardless of who they were pinging, that on average, people were spending about half of their day thinking about something else other than the appointed task. And whereas mind wandering had initially been thought to be a problem for people with dementia or a problem for people with ADHD, that it was an attentional problem, now they realize, no, it's normal. Everybody is doing it as often as they possibly can. So here's one of my favorite stories of working next to a friend. We went to visit. She was a lawyer, and the two of us were working together, so she chose to sit in this chair with her back to the window, and I was sitting at 90 degrees to her. We're both working on our reports, writing away, And I'm kind of watching that every so often she's typing away. She's a very good typist, and then just stop and then look over, look back, and go back to work and type, and then go back, look, type. And so I started timing this, being a researcher, right? So I'm surreptitiously keeping track of how far apart these things are. And when we stop for a coffee break, I say, so what are you looking at when you look out the window? And she says, I don't look out the window. That's why I sat with my back to the window, so I wouldn't be distracted. I said, oh, but au contraire. I've been timing you. And she said, oh, no, it's just the postman. I heard him making a sound, so I wanted to see if he was coming to our house. I said, no, it's not just the postman. You've been doing this every 5 minutes or so. She said, oh, no, that's absolutely not true. And I've tried this a few other times and just found that in general, people are very unconscious about glancing out the windows. But I've started to call these circadian snacks. Just a little grab, just a little pick-me-up to look out the window without needing to think about it. There's been a group of psychologists at UC Santa Barbara who have been studying mind wandering fairly intensely. And in general, their findings are that the more people report spending time daydreaming, the larger their working memory capacity, the better long-term memory consolidation they have over time, remembering what happened in the past. They're also doing more planning for future actions, what I'm going to buy at the grocery store when I go shopping, or what I'm going to do on my vacation next year. And most importantly, perhaps, is better incubation of problem solving. So when put forward with creativity tests, if people were given a period of time when there was no demands on their attention, so complete void, or perhaps just a little music, a little low-key activity, that their ability to solve problems expanded, and they came up with more creative solutions. So although these tests have not been done with windows, and I wish that someone would do that, hint, hint, this is what I do when I look out of windows. So I'm going to make that leap, that just being able to change your focus from task at hand to outdoors involves some of these creativity pieces. And having watched my own father do this, we used to joke that, oh, Dad's having a window. Gotta leave him alone. He's staring out the windows. So here's my favorite photograph of a bunch of students at medical school that are supposed to be learning about x-rays, and pretty much they're all compensating for the lack of windows with what's on their screens. So I'm going to switch gears now from this perhaps creative interaction that we have with window views to how window views might work with circadian stimulus and with other neurological stimulus. So first, a quick reminder that about 20, 25 years ago, we were first learning about the IPRGC and the retina that are receiving signals and getting translated to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's the crossing of the optic nerves there, which is driving our circadian rhythms. We have melanopsin in the eye, which is a photoreceptor molecule, moving and driving the rhythms of melatonin from the brain, which is a hormone, and circulating throughout the whole body. So you'll hear these two words interacting. This graph is trying to show how important the rhythm of melatonin, which is a hormone of darkness, that's creating this sort of metronome of timing for our body to keep us in sync with planetary rhythms and all the other hormones that are responding in kind on that same rhythm and same synchronization, to the point that keeping that timing in pace is extremely important to all aspects of our physiology. So the last 20 years, we have really been learning more and more about how essential coherent circadian rhythms are to health and well-being. But what I want to emphasize is that that key signal that's driving this rhythm, the melatonin, is the reception of the IPRGC to a blue sky signal. So here we've got a graph showing the spectral distribution of sunlight, which is the light blue line, or diffuse sky radiation without the sun, which is the heavy blue line at the bottom, both of which are peaking at pretty much exactly 480 nanometers. So this is not a coincidence. This is Mother Nature finding a way to tell our biology chemically that it's daytime. We need to go out and do our daytime things, look for food, go hunting, go to work, or it's nighttime, the absence, and that it's time for us to do nighttime things. So in searching for the blue sky, that is also the primary signal that we get by looking out a window, especially into a sunlit space or into the sky. Those reflections are predominantly in this same range. So we're getting a very strong signal by looking out the window, and that's what I want to give you a better example of how strong that is with view compared to the illumination in the space. So here's your circadian snacking. Now, the interaction of all of these hormones and neurotransmitters is also cyclical and have feedback loops to the point where serotonin, which is a hormone made primarily during the day, is the primary precursor to the manufacture of melatonin. So if you don't have enough serotonin during the day, you can't manufacture sufficient melatonin at night, and perhaps vice versa. But clear findings have shown that brighter exposure to light during the day is protective against the negative impacts of light, especially blue light, at night. So we've got this sort of two-cylinder engine working where brighter days are actually helping to compensate for more light exposure at night. Now that's the classic story in a nutshell of what we've learned about circadian exposure over the last 20, 25 years. But now the plot is thickening. We are learning so much more beyond sort of that simplistic story, which is now, instead of just one type of IPRGC, researchers have identified at least 6 different varieties. These 6 different varieties are communicating with at least 17 different parts of the brain, including memory formation, navigation, alertness, many different responses. It's complicated. And not only do we now have this melatonin stimulus, they've also identified 2 new types of opsins, which have additional roles, which are just being sorted out now. So these are called neuropsin and encephalopsin. They're found both in the eye and the retina, but also in other tissues throughout the human body. And so the advancement in science right now is trying to understand what roles those have and how these pieces are all interacting. So to just give you a flavor of this, we have neuropsin, which is also called opsin 5. There's so many of these opsins. There's dozens and dozens of them. They're now getting numbered instead of named. It's found not only in the retina, but also the cornea, multiple brain locations, and in skin cells. And then encephalopsin, opsin 3. In the lower picture here, the light blue in the white skin, white fat cells is showing that there's a photoreceptor in the fat below our skin. What's up with that? What role is that playing? So I'm going to skip over all the current speculations on what roles these opsons are playing, and just move on to a study showing how that might play out relative to architecture. But I would add, going back to my original analogy, that maybe these are the micronutrients that you get from eating fresh berries, that you get from a good bowl of soup. These maybe are not the major players, but they're very important to our overall health, as we might see. So moving over into the architectural realm, here we have a spectral transmission graph for different types of glazings. All right, this was put together for me by Tom Culp using the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab International Glazing Database, where he sort of put together different generations of glazing. And the top line here, black line, is simple clear glass. And then the blue and the purple lines are the first and second generation of low-E coatings that were primarily focused on reducing the transmission of near and far infrared wavelengths through the glass, right? So here they are. Now in third, fourth, and fifth generations, green to yellow to red, we can see that that near infrared is being pushed down further, further, further to the point where in many wavelengths we're getting less than 90%. We're reducing the near infrared by 90% or more. And now we're going to take this other region, which is up in the near infrared outside of the visible, and expand it over here and look at the same conditions that are happening with opsin 5, neuropsin, where you can see with these increasingly more stringent low-E coatings, opsin 5 transmission into spaces is being reduced by 50%, and now in the most extreme, down 90% of what was previous. And then the story is not quite as dramatic for opsin 3, but still we're getting about a 50% reduction. So the question is this biologically significant? How important is that level of exposure to people for medical conditions? We don't have these answers yet. We're just beginning to get good data on what normal exposures are, typically only within the visible spectrum. This type of analysis says we need to expand that monitoring beyond the visible spectrum into the ultraviolet, into the near infrared, in order to better understand how this might be affecting our physiology in normal life, in normal buildings. But to try to get just a little handle on it, I worked on a small beta study with Malika Inyasi at the University of Washington, where we took a fairly common elementary school classroom from California that was being used as a daylit classroom by the teacher, so she was successfully teaching her students without turning on the electric lights, to see what the stimulus looks like through these windows. So Malika put this together as a simulation in her LARC program. But first we went out with a spectrometer that was only measuring visible light, so the range is from 400 to 800 nanometers. And here's the spectral distribution and intensity of the overcast sky in San Francisco. And then on that same day, same time, looking up at the whiteboard from the back of the classroom, you can see that this is the daylighting stimulus relative to what could be found by just stepping outdoors. So big, big shift. But now we're going to take a closer look at this indoor stimulus. So this is a complicated slide, but you can feast your eyes on it. Here in this first row, we have a visualization of what a black and white photograph of that space would look like. In the second row, this is photopic units, so this is our visual system rendered in a false color image. You can see the windows are very bright in this, then they get darker. Now the rows here, this is clear glass. So that black line at the top that I showed you, this is tinted low E glass, which was the existing condition that we found at the school. And the bottom row is done at nighttime with just the electric lights on. But these are very high quality, state-of-the-art electric LEDs. And the next row, we go from photopic units to melanopic units. And then the fourth row here is neuropic units. So what does the stimulus to neuropsin look like? And in general, what you can see is that there's a dramatic loss of stimulus in the neuropsin piece, both for tinted low E glass and for low LEDs. So basically, very, very little coming through the windows. But given the chance, the windows are by far the strongest stimulus available in that space. So, to finish up here, I would just like to say that in moving forward, what we really need to focus on is who needs that stimulus, where they need the stimulus, when they need the stimulus. This is not universal. This is something that we need to really focus on and prioritize. So thank you.